Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the admissions made by Google-YouTube that they were engaging in mass scale censorship and shutting down of conservative voices. Now, even the more popular and successful conservative voices were shut down completely. Some were demonetized and then later shut down. Others were shut down and then later allowed to come back, but were demonetized and so on. Now, the income that some of these conservative voices, because they were widely followed, the income that they were making, or some were making, well over $100,000 a month from the monetization. And when this was cut off, of course, even if the channel isn't cancelled, that's a huge hit to their income. So they were having to sort of scale back their activities and become more basic and vanilla, and didn't have as much time and hands to engage in research and things like that. So it was quite limiting. Even tiny channels, like Tacitus Today, were issued with restrictions. The amount of views that this channel was getting fell substantially. We're talking an average of 3,000 or 4,000 views per video to an average of less than 100 views. That was how drastic the reduction was, and also constantly getting warnings, getting strikes, this sort of thing. Now, the strikes were far enough apart that but at one stage the channel got 2 strikes, no explanation why. You don't even know why. You say, well, what's the reason for the strike? And you just get no answer. But clearly it's because the message that this channel and many others, of course, was putting out was the conservative message, or was calling into question the lies of the globalist media. Now, given that their whole propaganda narrative rested upon lies upon lies upon lies upon untruths and so on, then they couldn't tolerate having that called out, because that would expose the whole narrative as being false, which it was. But this was a universal thing that went from the big channels, the major channels, the big platforms, the bigger platforms. And for those that managed to navigate through it, they had to tone down their criticism of the globalist messaging and the globalist narrative. And if they didn't, that's it. They'd be off. And there were some very successful, particularly channels that were good at getting to young people, like James Allsop and folks like that. They're very good at getting to a young audience, and they were particularly singled out for being shut down. And they also worked in concert, trying to. So if some conservative voice is going to shut down on, for example, YouTube, then they would be shut down simultaneously on Twitter, as it then was, on Facebook and other platforms, all at the same time, so that they couldn't move to another platform and say, look what they're doing over there. So it was a very systematic, very controlled, very coordinated, very premeditated attempt to shut down just all conservative voices, or not necessarily shutting down conservative voices, but any criticism of the globalist narrative, any questioning of the globalist narrative was really what they were doing. Now, they justified this by saying that it was it wasn't really censorship. They sort of, well, it's not really censorship. We're just stopping evil. That's what we're doing, and we're stopping Hitler, and we're stopping Nazis, we're stopping fascists. So we're the good guys. Okay, sure, we're breaking the First Amendment. Okay, sure, we're breaking laws. All right, sure, we're doing conspiring, and we're operating in conjunction with the federal government, the globalist controlled and directed Democrat Party. But look, it's for a good cause. We're allowed to break the law. But these other guys, they're not breaking the law or anything like that, but we're going to shut them down anyway because, again, they're questioning the globalist message. the globalist message will lead us to utopia. If you're against the globalist message, that means you're against utopia. Who's against utopia? Well, Hitler is it. The Nazis are the swastikas. And this is how they sort of morally and legally justified it. Now, the organs of law enforcement and justice and so on were all controlled by the globalists. So they very handily decided not to prosecute these brazen, blatant breaking of the law. But there you go. Now, this was going on for quite a long time. It was happening universally, I suppose, from the moment Donald Trump declared he was a candidate, or from the moment it looked like Donald Trump was going to be the candidate for the Republican candidate. So we're talking 2015, early 2015, I guess, late 2014. When he declared that he was going to be the candidate and that it was likely he would be the Republican candidate for the presidential election. And that's when things suddenly changed. Now, there's been selective application of globalist messaging in various areas. For example, there'd been endless propaganda about the oppression of women by evil white men, only in first world countries and only by white men. But this was universal. Now, any attempt to talk against that narrative was quite brutally put down with all sorts of threats to the media. I knew a journalist who was writing stories about, this is years ago now, was writing stories about how the divorce courts were stacked with radical activist lesbian feminists, and there was a lot of conspiracy and so on to make sure men were depicted as evil, fascist, Nazi, child beating, wife abusing monsters and so on, and that this was all very much part of a narrative rather than anything factual. And he was doing some investigative journalism on this and exposing the level of fraud and conspiracy to create this narrative, and then the ideological fanatics in the divorce courts and so on. And he's doing some quite good work on this. And I was staggered that a centre-right government at the time, the Attorney General's department and the legal infrastructure came straight after this a major media outlet, by the way, came after this media outlet, sort of threatening them. Look, hey, you stop this criticism of our narrative. You stop man bad, man oppressor, woman oppressed. You stop criticizing. That's our narrative. If you criticize it, we will come after you. So much so that the editors and the owners of this again, a substantial media outlet, decided it just wasn't worth the aggravation of taking on the federal government and having a full-on fight and getting dragged through the courts and all this sort of stuff. And also, their journalists not getting access to politicians for writing stories and getting scoops and this sort of thing. So they just backed off. So, okay, all right, we won't criticize. Okay, we'll stop. So that sort of pressure to shut up this journalist and to stop. And so from that point on, there was really no negative coverage of that narrative, oppressor man, oppressed woman. No criticism of that narrative was permitted, and they stopped. They stopped straight away, due to so this idea of governments going after media outlets or any sort of public information source in the public square, going after them to shut them down. This was very much part of the playbook of the wider globalist messaging, and this going after the gender, fault lines and creating, fantasizing, creating this idea that there was mass oppression and all this sort of thing. But it was only ever white men, funnily enough. This was very much part of the globalist. And I got onto it first off when I was doing international, business traveling, doing a lot of it at the time, and I would, as I've mentioned in other videos, depending on how the housekeeping was in the airplanes, I would often get the newspaper, like I've got a newspaper in Los Angeles. This is pre-internet. Los Angeles, then I'd get the newspaper out of New York, and then the plane had come in from London, and I'd have the newspaper from London. So I had like 3 newspapers all printed within a 24-hour period, around the world in different countries and different ends of the country and so on. And I'd read the editorials in them, and they're all the same editorial. Studies have found that 5 million women every day are being murdered by evil fascist Nazis, swastika waving, husbands or boyfriends. All the men are white, and this is a study by Rachel Butch-Dykestein, professor of women's studies, and so on and so forth. But it would be exactly the same. It was exactly the same copy. They just changed it. The New York academic lesbian was then in London. So they just changed it to a London university and a local name, or a Los Angeles university, a local name. But it's the same article, the same stats, exactly the same numbers, exactly the same amount of women were being oppressed, and so on and so forth. And so this narrative spinning and creating, whether it be gender drama and confrontation, or race drama and confrontation, it didn't matter. It was all part of this narrative spinning, the far right, and so on and so on, neo-Nazis. And so this playbook had been around for quite some time, but it was patchy. It was, a bit here, a bit there. There wasn't that sort of smooth consistency. And I guess a few things sort of happened. The revenue, as the internet started to bite, and people started going to social media for their news, the advertising revenue that print media and TV media and so on had relied on to pay the bills and that sort of stuff, that started to dry up. And there's a newspaper in Australia that made gazillions out of advertising, job advertising. And when the job internet boards came along, what it cost you $5,000 to put an advert in the newspaper now cost $200 to put online, or $300. So it totally changed the economics of it and switched the revenues around, not only advertising, but in things like employment advertising, as well as product advertising and services advertising. So that completely changed. So when the media outlets started peddling this insane propaganda, they switched from being journals of record to being peddlers of the globalist narrative. Now, I assume, well, no one's going to, back in the day, I thought, well, no one's going to listen to that nonsense. It's obviously crap. It's obviously lies. It's obviously hysterical nonsense. So those journals, those media outlets, they're not going to be able to survive because no one will be watching them or listening to that crap. Well, that was when the funding model changed. So the funding model switched from advertising and so on. That dried up, but then it switched to ideological funding. So these same outlets, whether it be the CNN or the MSNBCs or the New York Times or whatever, around the world, it didn't matter. The London newspapers, the Australian newspapers, TV stations, the funding model completely changed, and that none of these outfits, newspapers, were actually making money. They were all bleeding money, but nonetheless, their funding came in through an alternative funding model of the George Soros, the NGO activism, the charities, and these outfits merged. These media outlets merged with organisations that were so heavily on board with mass migration to get cheap labour or whatever it was. But so instead of being standalone media outlets that survived on the basis of their readership and their advertising revenues, that all went out. That all went out the window, and they were now being subsidised by people who didn't care how many viewers they did or didn't get. They were there to spread the narrative. So it was a massive international narrative machine that was being deficit funded. None of these places were making money. They were bleeding fuckloads of money. Bleeding serious money. So, and if you look even at the late night talk shows, say in the United States, you look at the cost of putting those shows to air, all the employees they have, hundreds of employees, the big ticket salaries that some of these talk show hosts have, tens of millions. And then you look at the advertising, they're running at a monumental loss. Again, they're bleeding, gazillions of dollars a week, but yet they stay on the air. Now, that wouldn't have happened previously. So this change in the funding model, this is what allowed the narrative, the propaganda to stay in place. Now, again, it was patchy. Sort of they were chasing, going down that rabbit hole and so on. There wasn't really consistency. There's a consistency, straight white men are bad, but it was a building narrative. It hadn't reached crescendo proportions. But the day Donald Trump decided to become a candidate, and where he looked like he was going to win, that's when the entire system flipped. And you can see almost straight away. I watched, I think it was called, it was like a political sort of current affairs show. I think it was called With All Due Respect or something like that. And they interviewed one of candidate Trump's team. I think it was 2015. And there was no thought that Trump would win or come close or get anywhere. And but they were reasonably respectful for this. Might have been Kellyanne Conway, actually, was that. But they were reasonably respectful to her. They asked, decent enough questions. They didn't sort of pepper her with sneering, condescending questions or gotcha questions. It was reasonably respectful, I thought, and they were sort of asking genuinely about the issues, the candidate's views on this or that, and so on. And but then fast forward a few weeks, and it now looks like Trump's going to be the candidate, the nominee for the Republican Party for the presidential election in 2016. And the difference, the difference in how they treat, and I think again it was Kellyanne Conway, the difference in how they treat the sneering, the derision, the gotcha questions, the laughing, the sniggering. And it was, I almost couldn't believe it when I saw this interview. Is this an interview? I mean, these people have obviously been told, I think it was three of them, they've all been told to bring her on and beat the proverbial shit out of it. They've obviously been given those instructions because it was so intense and coordinated and scripted and this sort of thing and you could see she was quite bewildered by the viciousness of the onslaught. I think she held up passably well, really, considering how rude and intemperate they were. But that was when the narrative began to become uniform suddenly, and for the first time anywhere in the Western world, a candidate for political office that looked like they could win. The candidate for political office was not someone the globalists controlled. Every candidate all across the Western world has been globalist controlled. And if they demonstrated they were not globalist controlled or weren't sufficiently under the thumb of the globalists, then the globalists just get rid of them. In Australia, there was a prime minister that wasn't 100% on board with the Green New Deal, didn't really like the mass migration thing, thought that there should be, skilled migration was fine, but not mass migration. And he was kind of a foot in each camp. He was giving the globalists, quite a bit of what they wanted, but not all of it. But no, they weren't having that. You're out, buddy. So a prime minister elected by the Australian people was just booted out. Just, no, you're out of here, dude. And a pro-globalist merchant banker was installed by the globalists, who was a fucking disaster in my view. But nonetheless, Trump was the first guy in the Western world that the globalists didn't control that looked like he could win. And that scared the pants off them. They had uniform, universal control. This was when, I believe, they began to put the machinery in place. Now, there was still uncertainty whether Trump would win. Pretty much everybody that was talking on the social media, certainly in the mainstream media, the globalist narrative machine media, thought that Hillary would not only win, but could possibly win all 50 states. That was so when it became plain on election night, in fact, they were so sure Hillary would win I think they conjured up 2 or 3 million votes just to make sure in states that they thought maybe were at a risk of going to Trump, but it wasn't enough. Their cheating just wasn't enough. Their rigging just didn't go far enough. And of course, Trump won in the swing states, and this took them by surprise. They hadn't seen this coming. And during election night, where I was watching on Fox News, I fully thought Hillary would win, certainly based on what I'd seen in the media. And so when it became plain, I think when Trump won Florida, it became fairly plain he was probably going to win. And I remember looking around and thinking, you've got to be kidding. There's no way, the actual non-globalist candidate is going to get up and win in spite of everything again. And the entire media machine was against Trump. Everywhere, the entire machine was against him. And yet he still got up and won. And that scared the globalists even more than Trump standing as a candidate. So this is when they sought to professionalize and universalize the media machine. This is when they really went for it here. They thought, we can't have another incident like this. We can't have another candidate somewhere, whether it be in, certainly none of the Anglosphere. We can't have a political candidate for office that gets up. In the Westminster system, a prime minister the globalists can get rid of, because they control so many of the party machinery and the politicians. They just make sure the guy gets kicked out by a party room vote. But with the president, you can't do that. The people decide who sits in that Oval Office. Only the people can remove them or their term limit. So this is when the globalists really panicked and thought, no, we have to have a media narrative machine that we control completely. No voice that criticizes or questions us or calls into doubt our narrative is allowed. And that's when it really started to bite. And everywhere you went, you only got the globalist message. That was pretty much. Even yesterday I logged on to YouTube and called up a video that was positive, centre right, I suppose, somewhat positive to Trump, President Trump. And other than that video that I called up, and I hadn't logged in at this point, I was just logging in as a private citizen, if you like. Every story in the feed, every fucking story in the feed was negative to Trump. Every one. Now that's not an accident. So even today, it's still happening. The blatant manipulation of the news that we see. If I put any subject just on an online search, Google online search, only the stuff that's negative to Trump will come up on the first couple of pages. You're at the third or fourth page before you see even a single article that's positive about. If I make an inquiry about say, I don't know, right-wing news, Breitbart, say, for example, Breitbart news, there'll be the Wikipedia, there'll be the Guardian, there'll be all these articles denouncing Breitbart news as being far right, associating with swastikas and Hitler and Nazi. So again, the narrative control is still there, but now YouTube is admitting that the colluding with the goons in the Biden administration. That Biden even knew what day it was at this point, but colluding with the goons in the Biden administration was if they identified a popular conservative or any conservative voice, particularly a popular one, that criticised or questioned the globalist narrative, they wanted to shut down that guy, shut him down. But that's been going on, as I mentioned earlier, years ago, about the narrative around divorce courts, all men are evil and this sort of stuff. That playbook's been going for a while. It just hadn't been so deeply entrenched or universalized and hadn't spread around social media from legacy media and that sort of thing. So this is what's going on. But the globalists or have the globalists been defeated or anything like that? Far from it. Far from it. We now have conservative voices and opinions and thus criticisms of the globalist project. We now have that, or much more of it than was allowed previously. I'll close with this thing of when the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the communist bloc all fell apart, quite a few people started coming to the West, Russians and so on, to Australia, and it was interesting that they would laugh at the communist era. They thought it was, dangerously funny because you could get arrested and thrown in prison arbitrarily there for having wrong things. But they never believed the lies because it was completely a controlled media. You weren't allowed to see anything that wasn't the party line or the ideological, Communist Party line. And if you did, even whisper something to someone at work, if someone overheard that conversation and the person you whispered it to hadn't reported you, they could go to prison as well. That's how sort of hazardous it was to not toe the party line. So most people just remained silent and said nothing. But talking to the Russians that were coming up, and these are people that are like in their 30s and so on, they thought it was a joke. They always knew that it was lies. They always knew it was bullshit. They always knew it was nonsense, but they just couldn't say anything about it. But when the communist system fell over, it was revealed that something like 70% of the population never believed. It was all considered to be absolute nonsense. And the majority of the population that did believe it were nearly all women, funnily enough. So there you go. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.